So, a couple of years ago, I was playing Metroid Prime in my dorm room, and I accidentally spilled Dr. Pepper on my controller. And I was pretty upset because at that time, controllers were still not back in production, so they were more expensive and harder to come by. But, and it's also the Orange Spice controller, which was my favorite. But it still worked, miraculously. It's just the buttons were really sticky. I never got around to opening it up in the first place because of the special proprietary screws in the Gamecube controller. But recently, I bought the tri-wing screwdriver necessary for opening up a Nintendo Gamecube controller. And I fixed up my Orange Spice controller, and it works great again. It's perfect. And now that I know my way through Gamecube controllers better, I decided to offer to my friend, who I know had a lot of controllers that were in bad condition, that I could fix up and clean his controllers and replace some of the bad parts. And everything was going great, but then I realized that he has some of these Gamecube controllers that are not OEM. And a lot of people who are familiar with the Gamecube probably have seen these in recent years. They look almost exactly like the Gamecube controller, but have a few noticeable cosmetic differences and don't play quite as well. You'll notice that the Gamecube decal is not on there, and same with any inkling that it's Nintendo. It's just the shell. And I think the only other noticeable differences are that the color is a little bit off on some of the buttons and sticks. The D-pad looks to be made out of a slightly different material because this one doesn't have the sheen. And, of course, the screws that you can notice on the outside. But otherwise, they're effectively the same thing. This controller seems a little bit to have more pliable cable. But, and after I offered, I realized that, and I was kind of a little bit afraid because I hadn't actually opened one of these up, and then I started getting excited because as much as these controllers, I've never opened them up before, they look to be exactly like a GameCube controller. This isn't a Mad Catz or anything where it's obviously a knockoff. This looks like they almost fired up the exact same production line. I will see that it's not quite true, but I thought it'd be interesting, since I've already opened one of these up. I know what's going on inside now, and I thought it would be interesting to open it up and show everyone why they work a little bit different, because I've never really seen it. Everyone opens up Gamecube controllers on YouTube. But it's always the OEM ones because no one wants to buy these ones. But it is kind of interesting to see why these work a little bit different, and actually what you can do to make them work more like this one. But he doesn't have any more original Nintendo Gamecube controllers for me to fix. So I'm going to be cleaning his Wavebird instead, because they are the exact same thing, except the normal one has the rumble, and the Wavebird doesn't have the rumble but has the wireless capability. So, let's get started. I actually forgot that I wanted to go over what exactly the functional differences are first. It's just going to be really quick. You'll notice with a Gamecube controller that the Z button is a little bit lofty, and then you can go all the way in and click it. On the non-OEM ones, it doesn't really do much, and it's a very stiff click. Also, in general, the buttons on these ones just don't seem to respond as well. And lastly, the triggers are a little bit more sticky and stiff. A lot of people might notice that the triggers can get stuck if they aren't hit quite right. So, and lastly, kind of a cosmetic difference, but not quite at the same time. I'll explain that once I open it up. But, you know, I noticed on a lot of his there's exposed wire, which doesn't really change anything because it's still got its insulation, the individual wires, but it just doesn't look good. And now we can open them up. And actually, he does have another Gamecube controller that I could open up. You know what? Should I do that? The thing is, it has a bad sensor on it, which I don't have my sensors in yet, and I wanted to replace that for him. It's a little bit loose. Yeah, I'll just open this one. Alright, so for the sake of getting the batteries or not batteries, buttons, not thrown around everywhere. Okay, so this is your standard Gamecube, mostly standard Gamecube inside guts. As I mentioned, I think part of why those other controllers can have the C-stick in away position is because, as you'll notice, this part of the board is completely separate. It's just kind of attached with the ribbon, which I'm surprised it doesn't move around very much once it's being played with this design. I guess it's just really seated well in the plastic. But all the basic contacts you'd expect for each button. All the pads you'd expect. A, B, X, Y, up, down, left, right, and then your analog sticks and start button. Z is received by this switch. And pay attention to all that, because whenever we open up the other one, it'll be kind of interesting to look at. And then we have this, and this will be interesting to look at too, for a couple of reasons. Now his L&R buttons are a little bit dirty, and they're not too hard to take out and put back together, so I'm just gonna... So these shields kind of just keep them in place, as far as I can tell. You can see that there's these two prongs, and they match up with the holes here. Not the screw holes, the ones that are inner, and it just kind of holds the assembly in place a little bit. Same thing over here, and I will go over that, how to take these apart actually, because no one else really seems to have a video on YouTube about cleaning left and right triggers. So you can easily just take it out at an angle, and this is what it's like. You've just got this sitting on that with the spring in between, and you've got the stabilizer, which you can just pop off, and that's pretty much what goes on in there. You'll see when we open up the non-OEM one that the inside is actually the same too, interestingly. Oh man, you know what, I should have opened up a normal one, because there's something that isn't on the Wavebird because of the wire not being there, but that'll be easy to explain. So I'm going to clean this, and I'm not going to record that because that's not necessary. There's a lot of cleaning guides. But yes, I'll be back. Okay, so I realized there were a couple things I forgot to point out. Just pay attention to the construction of these buttons and such, and what they look like. It's really discolored on the back for some reason. And these also. And on that note, and here we are. Now, clearly a very different circuit board, but that's not necessarily unexpected. But some things that, the first thing that I noticed was that the Z button doesn't have a spring. Instead, it sits where it would normally in this hole, but it just rests right on top of the switch, which is why the Z button on these feels so much stiffer, because there's no give without the spring. Normally the spring would kind of like rest up in here. Now, next I noticed, why is there a screw there? That wasn't in the other one. Huh. That's interesting. Maybe it wasn't, I just didn't notice. I don't know. Anyway. Next I noticed these have a turbo and a slow, which I'm not sure why. I guess these were initially made with the intention of being like an actual knockoff controller, but or maybe this was supposed to be some sort of like modding thing, and if you wanted to, you could theoretically drill the holes in, because since that's a star button, you could feasibly just put a button here and a button here, and that's where they'd be. Next, these things are just a little bit stiffer than the other construction. They feel just a little bit less springy, I guess. But there's no really other difference than that with those. But I'm going to put these in here. Also, this seems to be pretty common with these controllers. If you, yeah, this is another thing you would have seen if I'd opened up an actual Gamecube controller set of the Wavebird, like an OG one. But okay, so here's this. Let's flip it over. The wire would come out here. On actual Gamecube controllers, the wire winds around this pin. And there's also a zip tie once it comes back around that puts the both of the sides together, so it's always in that position to go right around it. And that's part of how they keep it from moving around too much. Now, I think because I'm not sure why they skimped on the insulation that much, but I think in part because of the lack of the insulation, that's why those wires come out like that. they figured you're not going to see it because it should be inside the controller, but since it's just slightly less thick, it doesn't hold around that pin as well. And whenever you're moving it around and playing games and you accidentally yank on it, this, I assume, comes loose. That, or they're just really bad at winding it around that pin. Low success rate, I guess. Next thing that I thought was pretty interesting, and this is what I think blew my mind the most, was... Oh man, really? Wow, okay, this actually is a different... Okay, well, you're actually... I'm finding out even more than I thought I would. You know what? Now I'm confused. Okay, so this board is definitely the same board I encountered in the last one that I opened. It's exactly the same color. The turbo and slow are there. The text is the same. Looks like this camera stops recording at 12 minutes exactly for some reason. I'm not sure. But what I thought you would see in here was that these guards that you have to remove, they wouldn't be here. And that really interests me, because I noticed that on all of these controllers, a lot of the time people will find that whenever they're clicking in the left and right triggers, it's actually very, yeah, like that. It does that. But what's actually happening, from what I saw in the other non-OEM controller that I opened up, is they don't have these. The guards just, to cut costs, so they didn't make them. I guess some of them have them for some reason. Maybe it's a different run. It might be that they wanted to cut costs, and then found that this was a problem later on, and figured that they could make a slightly better product. So this might be from a different run, actually, and that's why there's these differences. But getting this out of the way, this is what I was expecting to see, just this. And you'll notice that it moves around a lot more. And that's why you end up with the ones that end up being stiff and hard to compress, because inside, I'll move this. So this is probably going to have a lot of cuts in it. This is the first video I've actually ever filmed like this. I've helped film videos before, but I've never done a solo kind of thing. So apologies if in editing this ends up having a lot of cuts and weird edits, but I'm not going back and restarting it. That's stupid. But I'm gonna pick up where I left off. Where did I leave off? Okay, so in case it didn't get recorded by the camera last time, I ran out of room on my camera, on my card. Whenever I pulled back the circuit board, I was actually really surprised that these covers were here, because the last one that I opened up didn't have those covers, and that was something I was really actually kind of excited to show. And that actually explains why a lot of these knockoff controllers have issues with the triggers. My guess is the covers used to be in here in the normal design, and they took them out because they wanted to cut costs even more, which would be why the spring for the Z button isn't there, and there's just all these general differences. And they wanted to cut costs even more, and so the one that I opened is a older model, or what I think is more likely is this one is the one that I opened last was a newer model, other way around. Or what I think is more likely is this one is a newer model. And as much as they wanted to cut costs, my theory is that because of the issues with the triggers, they weren't selling as many as they could, and so they decided that this part was necessary to help stabilize the trigger. Now, if you do have one of these that doesn't have these guards, whatever, instead you'll just have this resting in here that I took out in the previous take, and I already took it out, so I'm not putting it back in right now. But what happens, the reason why there's such an issue with the triggers being stiff on a lot of these knockoff controllers is because without that guide, the parts move around a lot more, and it attacks it like that sometimes, particularly whenever you're playing furiously, and it takes a little bit more force, and then it finally goes in, because it's coming at an angle and it's hitting the wall, which is actually very easily fixable if you just sand, or not super fixable, but fairly fixable if you just sand the front of this a little bit so that it's not as harsh of an edge, and whenever it does end up hitting that, it just kind of slides in naturally instead of conflicting. Now, that's something I'm not going to need to do on this one because it has the guides. One last thing, I was cleaning this controller, and I realized that there's a couple things that are strange. As I mentioned, I'm pretty sure the weird thing about this is it looks like they fired up the original production line or something. They like got their hands on the molds. But that doesn't seem to be quite the case. If you look at, this is an original Gamecube stick. It's definitely worn down, but this is it. And this is one of the knockoff ones. Immediately you can tell a difference. I'm not sure why this has those holes. I'm guessing something for fixing the rubber cap, but there is a difference in the molds, and I'm not really sure where that comes from. There's notch, which doesn't quite, it's obviously not symmetrical whenever put up against another notch. I mean, they're effectively the same. Oh yeah, and the inside, strangely, the inside actually looks to be constructed more with more structural integrity than the normal one, because it has more braces. That's just kind of funny to me, I guess. But yeah, there are mold differences, and that just kind of raises more questions on why it's so similar in cosmetics to the original Gamecube controller, but it's just like slightly off for some reason. I guess maybe someone just did reverse engineer molds and what came out was slightly imperfect, maybe. Kind of interesting though. But I figured I should demonstrate now that I'm putting it back together what I'm talking about with these cables. So in a normal GameCube controller, this is all insulated, these wires. They have the black insulation going all the way through. Oh man. They go around that plastic pin like that, and then they come back down, and then they come out the top. And I think that since it's not as fat without all that extra insulation, that's part of why these wires tend to come out on these controllers. But now it's just a matter of putting it back together. And since there's no zip tie like there would be on the normal wire, which is another means of cutting costs, I guess, it's a little bit of a pain to get it to stay in place as you're putting the pieces back together of the shell, but it works. And honestly, if that does happen, I noticed that if that does happen to your controller with the wires coming out a little bit, since that suggests that it's not on here, I would recommend opening it up and just trying to get it to go around, because it doesn't seem like it should be an issue. But I noticed whenever I was putting it back together that the wires actually were hitting the rumble pack part, which could cause some problems in the future. I hope you found the weird differences on the inside as interesting as I did. I think it's really weird that it has those extra contacts for the turbo and slow. What does slow even mean? I don't use knockoff controllers, so I don't know what purpose that would specifically serve. I don't do electronics too often. But yeah, thank you.